This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
So it's a great pleasure to welcome Elaine Tierney to speak to the seminar tonight. Elaine did her PhD as part of a collaborative doctoral project involving Sussex and the V&A, and it was on strategies for celebrations realising the ideal celebratory city in London and Paris 1660 to 1715. She's since been based last year at the Paul Mellon Centre, but also at the V&A, where she's done lots of things, including curating exhibitions, the Baroque exhibition and the Handmaids in Britain TV series of BBC 4. She's published a number of articles on festivals in London and Paris. She's particularly interested in the material culture aspects of festivals, things like fireworks, triumphal arches, scaffolds, that kind of thing. And she's currently working towards a monograph based approximately or loosely or however
at some point in the distance
on her PhD, and this is designed as part of that process. So look forward to very much to hearing what Elaine's had to say tonight in her paper, Idealising the Early Modern City, Festival Design in Theory and Practice.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to be here, and as I said, it's part of the slow progress towards the monograph, so this is kind of a critical moment for having feedback from people who can ask me awkward questions at this stage rather than when the thing comes out. So this paper starts not in the late 17th century but with rather more recent historical events. When the next slide eventually turns up. Oh, come on.
Are they big slides?
Of course they are. No. For the duration of my PhD project, I lived here, Hackney Wick, in sight of the Olympic Stadium, where I watched the waves of preparations that were deemed necessary for this part of East London to host a global event. From my vantage point, I couldn't help but dwell on the highly visible nature of the preparations made, the different waves of activities in the years, months and days beforehand, and most importantly, the huge feats of project management involved in organising an event that was spread across multiple locations over 17 days. As an event, it also offered insights into the complex relationship between a real urban environment and an event designed to embody and communicate a bundle of social, cultural, commercial and political ideals. For those who aren't familiar with Hackney Wick, it's in East London, and as this beautiful photograph I took myself would suggest, might be described as gritty and urban, although it has been subject to considerable gentrification in the past decade or so. The picture, taken in the months before the Olympics, was a pretty representative view, showing the impact of the Olympic Park, the rather murky-looking canal, and suggesting the area's combination of scrubby open spaces, warehouses and residential housing. It's a far more representative view than this, an official press shot of the stadium. Significantly, all traces of the building's urban location have been excised, and instead it appears in the midst of a bucolic idyll, stood in a meadow of wildflowers. This image, part of the London Organising Committee's rhetoric of preparedness, greenness, sustainability and urban regeneration, has transformed Hackney Wick into a suitable site for a global celebration. Now, this is by no means to suggest that London or Paris in the late 17th century are anything like London in 2012, but to stage one of the ideas that informs this paper and the larger project it's part of. The urban festival, whether early modern or post-modern, marks both the conjuncture and disjuncture between a rhetorical ideal and the challenges inherent in its practical realisation. The title of this paper includes a number of contentious terms that need unpacking before we go further. I'd say there'll be festival, design, theory and practice. First, to attend to festival, this term can encompass a whole host of activities, from carefully organised royal and civic occasions to more ad hoc festivities like local bonfires, illuminations and even the throwing of crackers and squibs. While my wider project deals with the full range of activities categorised as early modern festival, this paper focuses on a number of large-scale royal occasions because these were documented in sufficient detail to illustrate the complexities inherent in the practical realisation of the events. Second, design here is intended in its loosest sense to mean the full range of practices involved in the conceptual and practical realisation of the occasions. As such, it encompasses process of designing, of making and of project management. Third, the distinction between theory and practice is entirely deliberate. The paper will move from a discussion of festivals as exercises in conceptual design, so the theory of the title, both in the early modern periods and in the work of scholars who've written about this subject matter. It then moves on to account for the practice of the title by exploring the practical strategies used to realise events in the context of the early modern metropolis. In making this admittedly rather artificial distinction, I hope to reveal that festival design was a product of the complex relationships between ideals and concepts, so the political, ideological and iconographical aspects of occasions, and practice, the reality of devising, designing and making. So, how have scholars engaged with the design of early modern festivals? Broadly speaking, most studies have contributed to a clear sense of early modern festivals functioning as some form of conceptual or experiential design, as elaborate performances that harness recondite symbolism and allegory to meet the needs of specific political moments. Events have been treated as deft combinations of classical and biblical allusions, contemporary literature, and elements of local or popular traditions to create, or at the very least reiterate, an occasion's political or politicised agendas. And to some extent, this reading reflects exactly what festivals are meant to do, and that's this kind of sense of this actualisation of rhetorical ideals. The image here, which will arrive shortly, clearly demonstrates how festivals might communicate ideals and ideas. It shows the fireworks display on the River Thames that provided the festive climax to the coronation of James II in April 1685. If the props and scenery devised for the fireworks had a single take-home message, it was this: the inviolability of the event being observed. And the latter impulse informed the rather workman-like selection of decorative elements, which included Apollonian motifs, so the sun, royal ciphers, you can also see just there in the middle there, there's an imperial crown just above that, and then these two figures on either side are direct quotations from Reaper's Iconologia, so one of the period's most readily consulted compendia of symbolic, allegorical and emblematic figures and motifs. And they are just taken off the peg and deployed in this context, which I think is really interesting. Legitimacy of rule was hardly controversial subject matter for a coronation fireworks display. And yet, fully understanding the resonance of this imagery necessitates better understanding of the festival's wider context. Significantly, James's coronation had gone much better than anyone had expected. Throughout the 1670s and early 1680s, the existence and persistent existence of an openly Catholic heir had been a political hot potato, causing anxiety and outright hostility. And I'm just showing this because I think it's such a fantastic picture. So, of course, this was the most notable during the exclusion crisis of 1679 to 81, and kind of the high politics that manifested on the streets of London in the form of the lavishly designed Pope burning processions held annually on 17th November in those years. By emphasising the legitimacy of dynastic power, and more specifically the absolute rightness of the ritual by which this new king's power was formalised, the display apparatus responded to circumstances were both extremely local and particular, but made use of iconographical motifs that had much wider European currency. And this relationship between specificities and generalities was an important factor in how festivals worked as a form of rhetorical design, combining ideals, iconography and ideology in order to persuade. Now, I think this notion of early modern festival being this kind of pan-European language of visual and textual language is summed up in Teofil Ruiz's introduction to his survey of ritual and spectacle in Spain during the reign of Philip II. And this is, I'm going to quote this because I think it's really highly suggestive of how scholars have engaged with the fluidity, the elasticity and the flexibility that characterise the realisation of events. And I quote, "A history of festivals should of course be a history of cultural transmissions, or, to be more accurate, of the circulation of certain cultural tropes, artistic motifs and artefacts, as well as the broader movements of aesthetic forms and across national and regional cultures." And this, in a nutshell, is what most scholarly appraisals of these sorts of events have attempted to do. But how did we end up here? Why has the circulation of ideals and ideas, often at the cost of practical matters, become the main business of studies of early modern festivals? With very broad brushstrokes indeed, the historiography of festival studies could be summed up as the story of scholars learning to engage with a rather alien aspect of early modern culture by putting rituals, ceremonies, spectacles and performances in their contemporary contexts. and understanding the very real importance with which organisers, participants and spectators invested these occasions. In combination, studies from the middle of the 20th century onwards have refined our understanding of the politics and performance, excavating the social, cultural, political and religious imperatives behind events that could be dismissed as nothing more than high holidays, play acting or fancy parties. And fancy parties, in fact, how a more senior colleague at the museum used to refer to my research. How are the fancy parties going? Not very well, thank you. This paper does not intend to offer an exhaustive historiography of early modern festivals. It is a huge topic that presents significant variations that depended on historic and geographic context. However, it is absolutely imperative for present purposes to sketch out some of the main developments, as these have fostered omissions and distortions in how we have engaged with the realisation of events. And another picture should pop up soon. First, I'm going to broadly following the work of scholars such as Panofsky and Francis Yates, amongst others, attention to the fundamental differences in historical modes of thinking and reasoning contributed to a greater awareness of iconographical and referential modes in visual and textual narrative forms. In terms of festivals, this has meant identifying and picking levels of meaning in events that transcended the literal to reveal their significance for their early modern audiences. In essence, this approach applied to the study of festivals has contributed to the perception of a triangular relationship between choice of narrative, the deployment of allegory and symbolism, and the very particular needs of the political moment. And the example here is a part of an event at Versailles in 1664, and this image shows the moment in which this event was based on or inspired by Ariosto's Orlando Furioso, and had Louis XIV cast as one of the poem's heroes, Rogero Roger. And this image shows the moment in which the palace of sorceress Alcina was decimated by means of a magic ring being placed on Louis's finger. And the point here is that this fake palace is destroyed and disappears, and in the background you can see the expanding Versailles, so the sense that by removing the festival, there's a representation here of sort of the basis of Louis' power in the real world. And that's a reading from Kevin Salatino's book on representations of fireworks. So they're quite a nice example of that sort of way of approaching festival. Second, there has been a renewed, some might even say rehabilitated, historical interest in the role of courts as loci of social, political and cultural influence. In this context, festivals have been treated as mechanisms of rule. From Roy Strong's Art and Power, an early effort in the field, to more recent edited collections, so thinking here of Europa Triumphans and court festivals of the European Renaissance, rulers have been shown to use spectacular events and magnificent display to express and reinforce the limits of their power, and in some instances create an illusion of authority that went far beyond their actual power base. As John Addison has proposed, quote, "On those great state occasions when the court went out of doors, monarchs and courtiers alike seemed to have been acutely aware that the parade of all its splendour could serve a variety of pragmatic purposes, not least to enhance the reputation and diplomatic standing of the ruling house." Third, a performative turn in social and cultural history, influenced by theories and methodologies from anthropology and sociology, has led to subsequent generations of scholars identifying in court rituals and spectacles the essence of early modern political power, mining festival and its iconography for evidence of the relationship between power, social ritual and dominant ideology. As Peter Burke has argued in Performing History, the important of occasions, historical awareness, performance and performativity have implemented a, quote, shift from assumptions of social and cultural fixity to that of fluidity, from scripts to improvisations, from mentalities to habitus. Within this framework, politics can be conceived as a series of symbolic acts, with spectacle and performance absolutely critical to realising early modern power. And fourth and finally, in this whistle-stop tour of the historiography festival, studies of early modern festivals have been the products of more than one scholarly discipline. This absolutely reflects the reality of the events, which were multimedia and involved collaborations across artistic practices. The emergence of festival as a viable area of research owes depth to social, political and economic histories, court studies, developments and histories of literature, theatre, music, dance and popular culture, studies of art, costume and design, and reappraisals of the urban environment. And I'm sure I've left lots of things off that list which are also being put into the mix. More recently, this is manifested in inter- and cross-disciplinary research, with scholars working across disciplines within their own work or contributing to international conferences, research networks and edited volumes that pull together a wide range of expertise. But what does this mean for festival design and theory and practice? Well, The study of festivals has certainly enhanced our understanding of power structures that bound together early modern societies, of historical modes of thought, and the collaborative multimedia nature of spectacles and performances. And yet, emphasis on a particular type of source, and I'm thinking here of the presentational text and images used to promote events to absent contemporary audiences and record them for posterity, of which we've had quite a few examples so far, but it's another one. So, an image from the history of coronation of James II showing the moment in which James is crowned. Alongside privileging the abstract and conceptual aspects of occasions, has fostered distortions and oversights on how we deal with events. Now, the example here is a recent attempt from 2011 to reconstruct Philip II's joyous entry into Lisbon in 1581. And I've deliberately chosen to go off-piste here with this example, so it's absolutely the wrong city and it's not the right time period. But it's a completely extraordinary demonstration, I think, of the logical endpoint of the historiography I've just outlined. The scholar who produced this particular piece of work, is probably a way of framing up, Laura Fernandez-Gonzalez, compared and collated archival and printed descriptions of the entry to create a computer-generated model of Lisbon during the festivities. Now, the digital entry is a hugely curious experience, I think. Now, I cannot be impressed by the technology at the scholar's disposal. You've just seen me struggling with that laptop, so this is far beyond anything I can do. And these tools being used to help put the event in its spatial context by showing where the event's temporary architecture stood in relation to the permanent built environment. But there is also something compellingly soulless in this remaking of Philip's entry. So rather than evoke the fragmentary, plural and experiential, this version of the event is notable for the absence of people and the spotlessly clean, uniform presentation of the city's buildings and landmarks. And it's actually an animated thing, so you kind of fly smoothly through this kind of computer-generated space with kind of tinny music being piped in. So it's a really odd repackaging. Its sense of everywhere and nowhere calls to mind early modern representations of festivals, such as David Logan's etching of one of the triumphal arches built for Charles II's coronation procession through London in April 1661. Here, I think, as in the computer visualisation, there is little sense of the world beyond the event, or indeed the world beyond this single element of the event. Instead, the viewer of this paper-bound festivity is presented with a version of the celebratory city that is devoid of people, of mess and congestion, where there is nothing to distract from the event's iconography and by extension its political agendas. And here perhaps is the rub. That even the most recent interpretations have been overly impressed by early modern festivals' effective publicity machine. In poring over the evidence provided by festival books and chronicles, this strand of scholarship could be regarded as repackaging the repackaged. There are, of course, many fantastic exceptions to this. We're thinking here of Margaret Toffner's work on Brussels and Antwerp in the late 16th and early 17th century, Christine Stevens' recent work on Restoration London, and Eric Manan and festivals in 18th century France, where there are certainly elements of the kind of the practice and prose material culture festival and the disruption of staging these hugely complex events in the context of spaces as other uses. I think is a kind of, if there's a design challenge at the festival, that's probably what it is. But let's return to this image and my analysis of it from earlier in the paper. In effect, I was choosing to read a printed static representation as a stand-in for the events it portrayed. Instead, this image was a carefully controlled, poised mediation, almost an event in its own right. It was deliberately produced as part of the event's official chronicle, the history of the coronation of James II, a volume that so pleased the new king and his queen, Mary of Modena, that they gave its author, Francis Sandford, a gold cup and thanks. And you can actually go and see the cup in question in the Goldsmiths Company collection. More to the point, how much can a static monochrome representation actually tell us about a fireworks display? Sandford's history of the coronation may give a flavour of the occasion, but this needs to be fleshed out by reference to documents in the Office of Ordnance Bill and Minute books, contemporary technical literature, and this Van der Velde depiction of the apparatus in situ before the display. So I think I'm just going to flick back. Sorry. So this bit here is this quite shoddy looking structure over here. It's a really different effect. And this is one of two drawings which are in the collection of the Maritime Museum. So absolutely fantastic big drawings, I think in common with lots of Van der Velde's depictions of maritime scenes and maritime battles. The curator I was talking to about the drawings seems to think that aspects of these would have been done from life and then collated in the studio. So it's a kind of it's probably it's a much more representative image than the print I showed you before. So this kind of, I suppose, a kind of sense of how the fireworks display as a series of built objects functioned in space. First, this was a scenic apparatus on a massive scale. The platform supporting the other scenic devices was recorded as an estimated 180 by 50 feet, the pyramids or obelisks as 36 feet high, and the allegorical figures around 12 feet. And these are from the bill and minute books kept by the Ordnance, so kind of the descriptions of the things as they're being made by commissioned workforce. Second, we can gauge what the apparatus was made from by who made it. On this occasion, carpenters, a turner and a joiner were employed to make the platform, obelisks, figurative devices and pedestals, suggesting these were wooden, and indeed there is significant payments out for the wood that's been used, while blacksmiths provided the cipher, crown, sun and the fittings used to hold the scenery together. Third, Sanford, the writer of the description of this in the festival book, was intoxicated with the poetry and variety of the fireworks used, which included, quote, water rockets, fire cones and swarms, girandels, rockets, mortar pieces, pumps, musket barrels and balloons. Now, the range of devices deployed, each with its own idiosyncrasies, attested the skill involved in coordinating fireworks displays, and more important, the extent to which this type of event should be treated as a form of experiential design. Records from 1685 suggested the ingredients used in making the pyrotechnic devices. Read in conjunction with the technical literature, these reveal the display's colour scheme, or kind of suggest what this colour scheme might have been. So amber, frankincense, mastic and gum reacted with oils to produce the varnishes that gave the fireworks a hint of warm red or orange, while iron filings and camphor produced a bright white. These colour effects were enhanced by locating the display on the River Thames. The latter was part safety measure, but also demonstrated the careful calibration of the design of early modern firework displays. And as Jean Chanson, who noted in his account of the fireworks for Louis XIV's entrée into Paris in 1660, I quote, "Fireworks always appear better in water than on land." The principal function of this image was to idealise, to edit and to reframe the event, is best illustrated by contrasting it with other accounts of what happened. Where it showed an event with lavish production values, where the fireworks quite literally fall into line, and yet John Aubrey's apocalyptic version of the same occasion couldn't be more different. And I quote, "Upon St. Mark's Day, after the coronation of James II, were prepared stately fireworks on the Thames. It happened that they took fire altogether, and it was so dreadful that several spectators leaped into the river, choosing rather to be drowned than burned." That this was more than literary hyperbole can be confirmed by payments made to Adam Ball, the Ordnance's messenger, to reimburse payments made for the, quote, "provision and lodgings of the respective gunners and persons burnt in exercition of their duties at the fireworks upon the solemnity of His Majesty's coronation." Due attention to the materiality of the firework display and its extended chronology, encompassing the period before the events, as well as its unexpected aftermath, has considerably complicated the meaning of the static image shown here. So the kind of the festival in theory, but also the kind of festival in theory is kind of reading it comfortably within the confines of festival studies. The huge distance between Adam Ball's medical bills and the depiction shown here demonstrates the extent to which depictions of festivals were a conscious redesign, but also showcases how events were a mixture of the planned and the unexpected. As the example used here illustrates, the latter, at best the unexpected, at worst absolute catastrophe, pose serious challenges for the successful realisation of events. Rather than approaching occasions as finished, completed bundles of rhetorical ideals, the second part of the paper will show how the design of festivals in London and Paris could be better framed as an organisational conceit, with serious feats of project management necessary to ensure that a wide range of things were in place, often different places, on time. The discussion does so by focusing on the design and installation of triumphal architecture in Paris in August 1660, before moving on to a more in-depth exploration of what was actually involved in project managing an element of public celebration by looking at the figure of Major Martin Beckman in London. These quite fragmentary examples will help tease out how the nitty-gritty of practical organisation can nuance understanding of the social, cultural and political ideals invest in early modern festivals, and, by doing so, add a layer of interpretation beyond the narrative and symbolic. Political ideals are absolutely at the heart of Louis XIV's entrée into Paris in August 1660. This was, after all, an event that sought to mark the young king's majority, France's recent peace with Spain, and to articulate the rapprochement between the king and his capital city after the years of instability that had characterised early years of his reign. The elaborate entry has in fact been described as Louis's very public act of forgiveness, with the city spending an estimated 100,000 livres in what was the diarist Guy Patin termed an expiation for its role during the Fronde. Such ideals were not merely embedded on the surfaces of triumphal architecture, or in the careful representations intended to commemorate aspects of the occasion's posterity, and which will illustrate the next part of the paper. They can also be found in the carefully, one might say anxiously, calibrated coordination of the design and construction of the occasion's massive triumphal architecture. A particular interest is evidence of the relationship between the event's organising committee, composed of Paris's municipal elites, and the designers and makers they employed to realise the most eye-catching elements of the event's design. 7 huge temporary structures were erected along the processional route and included 5 arches, which are the explicit focus of this discussion, a throne dais, and an amphitheatre. The commission of the arches was exceptionally well documented in the marché, or contracts, drawn up between the sort of bureaucratic centre and, for want of a better phrase, the team of creatives charged with designing, making and project managing each aspect of the event. The painter Pierre Melin realised the first freestanding triumphal arch at Porte Saint-Antoine, with the master carpenter Florent Lenoir drafted in to construct it. He was also responsible for this, so the Mount Parnassus, not far from the Hôtel de Ville. Come on. I know the next image is quite giant. Oh, that's fun. Henri and Charles Beaubrun, so cousins and painters, received the commission to devise a third arch for Pont Notre Dame at the city end of the bridge, and Michel Dorigny and François Tourtebat, also painters, responsible for the huge arch at Marché Neuf on the Ile de la Cité. Finally, Daniel Allais and Charles Poisson oversaw the Place Dauphine arch, which was the tallest structure built for the entry. Notably, its design was actually supplied by Charles Lebrun, with the painters Allais and Poisson employed to oversee, quote, all the painting work mentioned. Yet more painters, Jacques Lhomme, Jacques Desnaud, François Franquin, Charles Bacot, were contracted to paint its architectural details and make it look like golden marble, with Allais and Poisson acting as senior partners in the enterprise. Now, work has already been done on kind of attributing these individual structures to specific artists. What I think is really interesting here is the picture that is emerging of a project in 3 dimensions. So one that's multimedia, that's situated in multiple locations, and brought together the expertise of a large workforce, many of whom were unnamed. It sounds like an absolute nightmare to organise this entrée. Most importantly, this was an event that was located in time and space, and the marché offered vital evidence as how this transformation was achieved. Where images of the triumphal arches were largely monochrome and only provided a single, typically frontal view, the marché helped us to put flesh on this bare bones, suggesting how the structures worked as polychromatic, 3-dimensional entities by detailing scale, the materials used, construction techniques, and colour and finish. Where necessary, they also provided precise instructions for the composition of large format canvases, heraldic devices, and the deployment of architectural orders. I think it's also worth considering here the main material properties associated with triumphal architecture. First, the most impressive structures were built on an absolutely colossal scale and intended to inspire awe in those who saw, sat on, stood by and passed under them. And in 1660, this was the biggest structure, for the, which was kind of estimated to measure around 100 feet in height. And if you've ever been to Place Dauphine, the idea of a structure of this size being put at the kind of the small neck that faces Pont Neuf is actually, I do wonder about the veracity of some of my sources on this, but it is from the contracts drawn up with the workforces. However, even the smaller arches, so the Montparnasse and the arch built at Pont Notre Dame, reached the extraordinary height of 45 feet. Here is shown not an arch in canvas and wood, but the permanent stone Porte Saint-Denis, which can be found in Paris's 10th arrondissement. Designed by François Blondel, Porte Saint-Denis is approximately 75 feet high, So this is kind of a mid-sized arch by the standards of 1660. And is included here as a suggestive indication of the scale on which temporary arches were conceived, and more importantly, how they might have interacted with and indeed overwhelmed their immediate surroundings. Because you look at the depictions of the triumphal arches, they're all shown in this fantastic, glorious isolation, rather than as these, I think, impositions onto other kind of spaces with contested uses. Second, the occasional architecture erected in 1660 was made in canvas, wood and plaster, but painted to imitate more durable materials such as precious metals, marble, jasper and porphyry. And finally, by comparison with permanent monumental additions to the urban landscape, such as Pour Saint-Denis, the temporary structures could be erected and dismantled relatively quickly. In combination, such factors meant occasional architecture could be deemed to be transformative, with the ability to alter the appearance and experience of urban space in short spaces of time, enhancing what architectural historian Judy Loach has described as the trance-like effect of festival. This was a multifaceted multimedia event requiring decentralised teams of personnel working towards a common non-negotiable deadline. It is worth noting too that this complexity was evident without considering the other activities that contributed to the successful realisation of the event. So I've just talked about the triumphal arches, they're just one small part of the wider project. We also have to kind of think here about the choreography of performers and participants through the coordination of planning permission for viewing platforms, some of which are shown here, so a different sort of more functional structure that was also necessary on days of occasion, through the municipality's organisation of security and even the street cleaning in the lead up to the entrée on 26th August. And the records of this are incredibly detailed, so there's a stipulation of that the householders along the processional routes, and 3 days before the entrée will have to throw water out in front of the houses. So it's being micromanaged, or the attempt is being made to micromanage it. Nevertheless, even considered in isolation, the triumphal arches beg the question: how did a bureaucratic centre attempt to keep track of this facet of the entrée's project and influence its practical realisation? What measures were employed to keep tabs on this part of the event's realisation across time and space? So these multiple locations and over this, the 3 months spent preparing these triumphal arches. First, the contracts describe the supervisory practices used by the Bureau. Lenoir's contracts show that though Milan oversaw the work on the Saint-Antoine arch, he was in turn answerable to the Bureau de la Ville, as, quote, everything is to be made according to the design provided by the aforementioned Milan painter, as shown to the aforementioned size. Other documents attested to the role of Michel Noblet, Paris's master of works, in the preparations. So, for example, Torteban d'Origny's contract for the Marché Neuf arch indicated that although they were responsible for the look of the structure, and I quote, all was done under the supervision and surveillance and control of Sieur Noblet. For ease of supervision, Torteban d'Origny were even to be provided with a, quote, convenient place to work in, make and build said works, suggesting the arch was partially constructed off-site before being installed in situ. Second, work was begun well in advance, beginning months before the entrée, and thus leaving sufficient time to deal with any problems that arose. All the artists involved were contracted between 5th May and 16th June, and the entrée itself happens on 26th of August, so there's a certain amount of wriggle room there. More tellingly, deadlines for the completion of work were also set months ahead of 26th August, and Milan contracted to finish by 15th June, and Lenoir, the Beaubrun, Torteban and d'Origny by 20th June. The final major deadline for completion of all work on the Place Dauphine Arch was 15th July, still over a month before the entrée was to take place. Unfortunately, I've not been able to find any evidence of whether or not people did manage to make these deadlines. Third, the Marché attested to the financial incentives at the disposal of the Bureau. Payments in 1660 were made in stages. In common with other building projects in 17th-century Paris, a sum was paid up front, another instalment halfway through the job, and the rest on completion. These strategies suggest that the Bureau kept a tight hold on the realisation of the arches. The wording of the document showed that the process was much less prescriptive than this. Certain details, the composition of large figurative canvases, heraldic devices, were indeed described in minute details. But other aspects, painted finishes, decorative figurative devices, seem to have been left to the imagination of the artists involved, suggesting comparative free rein with those aspects of the decoration that didn't explicitly relate to the entree's iconographical programme. There's kind of just a note here that thinking about whether people did meet their deadlines, there's some sense of the workforce being moved around. So as certain projects seem to have fallen behind schedule, you have kind of painters being moved from one arch to another. The festival design is better considered as an organisational conceit, as further illustrated by the rather different example of Major, later Sir Martin Beckman, and his involvement in fireworks displays in late 17th century London. When Beckman left Sweden in 1645, it was the intention of joining his elder brother, an army captain and engineer at the English Office of Ordnance. His steeliness of resolve was suggested by his next documented move in 1660, when he petitioned Charles II for his brother's job, the latter having died after being ruined and severely injured by an accidental explosion in preparation of some fireworks. As a skilled artillery and explosive specialist, Beckman's rise to the ranks was steady but not without obstacles, as his imprisonment in the Tower of London and charged with espionage and tests. Still, his place in royal favour was assured by the claim during the Second Anglo-Dutch War that he had, quote, brought to perfection a mode of firing ships. By 1688, he'd been knighted and been appointed the very first comptroller of the fireworks, receiving an annual salary of £200 to supervise the production and proofing or testing of fireworks for both military and display purposes. At first glance, the professional experiences of Martin Beckman might seem like an eccentric addition to the discussion of early modern festival design. And yet, as a comptroller's job description suggests, not all the fireworks produced at the Royal Laboratory in Greenwich were destined for the battlefield. Some were, in fact, deployed in elaborately designed state-sponsored celebrations. In fact, Beckman was responsible for supervising the most spectacular fireworks displays witnessed by late 17th century London. Those for the coronations of James II, the image I've shown you over and over again, as described above, William and Mary in 1689, the birth of the Prince of Wales in 1688, and the Peace of Ryswick in 1697. And I think what I want to dwell on here is a kind of the seeming paradox between the deviser of intentionally destructive military hardware and the designer of intentionally delightful pyrotechnic effects, and the extent to which this was actually a lot less bizarre to early moderns. I think the point with this, having looked at kind of festivals and organisational conceit in relation to a number of structures being put up to deadline in Paris, the idea is to look at kind of how particular sorts of festival events involved a different type of kind of professional expertise and perhaps unexpected professional expertise. Abraham Boss's etching from the 1630s illustrated the two main contexts of fireworks, as well as a broad skills base of the men who made them. Part of his series depicting the four elements, the image envisaged fire as a pyrotechnician in the guise of a fashionably dressed young man holding a rocket in one hand with a lit taper in the other. To his right stands a fortified tower, and the left can just be glimpsed a similar crenellated structure surrounded by a large crowd of spectators. Crucially, this second tower was a prop, a temporary construction probably made out of canvas and wood, which provided a suitable platform for a celebratory fireworks display. The notion that a single individual might have expertise in these two broad categories of fireworks, military and celebratory, actually reflected the realities of contemporary practice. The issue of who made fireworks was intimately linked to who had access to their main constituent ingredient, gunpowder. From the earliest days of the industry in the late 16th century, gunpowder manufacture was a government monopoly in both England and France, reflecting its importance as a key strategic resource. And indeed, in England, gunpowder and fireworks were both under the control of the Office of Ordnance, the government body responsible for all kinds of military materiel. And by 1697, the Fireworks Act, it's in kind of within sort of national law that no one else apart from the Ordnance should have access to the technology to make these fireworks. And I've got here the frontispiece to a slightly earlier text. So this is John Babington's Pyrotechnia, and this is the first text in English just to deal with display fireworks. But it's worth noting here too that Babington himself was a gunner at the Ordnance. So although he's writing about display fireworks, his background is very much in these military explosives. So technical literature, alongside archival evidence of firework making, confirms that the same explosives technicians made both types of devices in London. The lack of distinction between fireworks at the battlefield and for festivals is reiterated by a close analysis of the ingredients used in both contexts. And I've looked through lots of lists of the ingredients being used in different types of fireworks, and there are very few differences in terms of kind of composition and basic construction between the display and the military ones. It's a kind of the big issue is scale. The military ones tend to be bigger. Now, this background helps make sense of Beckmann's involvement in the manufacture of the actual fireworks. But I think what's interesting here is that the detailed records kept by the Ordnance attest his role in the fireworks display went well beyond pyrotechnic hardware. So we've looked at one event where the sort of people in charge of designing are all artists and sculptors. But here we have someone who's designing festivals in London who has a completely unexpected background, I think. In fact, Beckmann took the lead in coordinating all aspects of the displays, with his workforce composed of three types of personnel. So the Ordnance employees who made the fireworks, the suppliers of ingredients for fireworks, and the materials used to construct the props and scenery, and the men who built and decorated the scenic apparatus. So kind of this hub for all these different sorts of activities. Although the fireworks were produced in-house in the Ordnance's laboratory in Greenwich, the manufacture of the display apparatus was also outsourced to other craftsmen, including carpenters, cabinet makers, joiners, wood carvers, ironworkers and painters. The diverse workforce involved in producing fireworks displays demonstrated the extent to which Beckmann's role was that of project manager, relied on to make sure the fireworks and display apparatus were completed of the requisite standards and in place on time. And I think again that issue of kind of timing and location is very important to any kind of definition we might try to pull together of what is festival design. Significantly, there was some overlap in personnel between the displays organised by Beckmann, which suggests he actively re-employed some of the same team, knowing to some extent the strengths of his workforce on these occasions. Thomas Amy supplied ingredients for the fireworks for displays to celebrate the coronation in 1685, for the birth of the Prince of Wales in 1688, the signing of the Treaty of Namur. So we've got this depiction here, which I think is one of the oddest late 17th century fireworks displays in London. There's no attempt even to hide the military origins of these fireworks. It's a Metropolitan, so it's a bit dingy. So these figures all around here are shooting into the centre of St James's Square. It's quite an odd way to celebrate the signing of the peace treaty. So Amy supplied the ingredients for Namur and then for the Peace of Ryswick in 1697. Robert Bennett supplied the barges that were moored in the middle of the River Thames, providing a floating stage for the fireworks in 85 and 88. Thomas Brown, gunner, made fireworks for the displays in 85 and 88. Thomas White Smith made ironwork in 85 and 97. Now, one can only speculate, but would it seem that these individuals employed again because of a successful performance in a previous event, or, as in the case of Amy, the supplier of the ingredients for the actual fireworks, the kind of explosive composite, the stuff that's not gunpowder that goes into the fireworks, provided a comparatively exclusive service. Beckmann's place at the head of his team was linked to his technical expertise as an artillery and explosive technician, as in this instance these were the least transferable skills involved in the production of firework displays. The notion that Beckmann was the designer of these occasions was in fact inextricably tied to his skills as a pyrotechnician. Although large format scenic devices were made for other kinds of events, and we've already looked at one of those other type of events, fireworks and the quantities used during fireworks displays were the exclusive territory of the Ordnance in England. Pyrotechnicians such as Beckmann were also able to generate an impressive range of sounds and coloured light effects, which depended on their knowledge of different pyrotechnical devices and explosive compositions. These fireworks were also designed to be dangerous and were identical in most respects to the explosives used in the battlefield. And as we've seen in England, they were even made by the same personnel. It made sense, therefore, for the person in overall charge of a fireworks display, in this instance its lead designer, so to speak, to be a specialist in the controlled deployment of the pyrotechnics, the aspect of the occasion that had the most scope for going wrong. That Beckmann was repeatedly employed to pull together major pyrotechnic spectacles from the 1680s onwards endorses his success in the role, as does the mezzotint shown here, depicting the firework display for the birth of a son and heir to James II in 1688. And supposedly so pleased was the king with the display that he awarded Beckmann sole rights of, quote, prince in mezzotinto showing the occasion, and I think it's this particular object here. Now, to conclude, This paper has taken an object and process-focused approach to the issue of how early modern festivals communicated political ideals. It deliberately and artificially distinguished between the processes by which festivals were realised in late 17th century London and Paris, and in separating out the theory and practice that were both essential to the successful execution of events, it sought to highlight the omissions and distortions at the heart of many existing studies. These have tended to focus solely on the conceptual design of occasions, or indeed to privilege this conceptual design of occasions, and in particular the relationships between recondite symbolism and allegory and politicised agenda. The second half of the discussion focused on the very practical strategies used to design, make and project manage aspects of events, employing as case studies the triumphal architecture built for Louis XIV's entrée into Paris in August 1660, and the perhaps surprising involvement of Martin Beckmann in the realisation of fireworks displays in London. Both examples were intended to reveal the extent to which the processes that could be dismissed as mundane of little interest, so thinking here about chains of commands, a mechanism of payment, the sort of business of repeat employment, can actually offer valuable, largely untapped evidence in these contexts that can be used to complicate the issue of how events generated political meanings. In combination, attending to both theory and practice showed how the realisation of early modern festivals could be accounted as the very practical business of attempting to actualise lofty ideals. Thank you.